The Galactic Convergence Council had been running for 600 years without a single awkward meeting. 600 years of dignified debate, carefully worded treaties, and species who had the good sense to evolve properly before showing up to the table. 600 years of everything going smoothly. Then humanity submitted an application. Ambassador Vreth of the Krillian Empire was the one who read it aloud, and to his credit, he only laughed for about 45 seconds before composing himself. He smoothed his ceremonial sash, cleared all four of his throats, and announced to the assembled delegates that the humans, yes those humans, the ones who had only achieved interstellar travel 80 years ago, were formally requesting full membership in the Convergence. The chamber erupted, the Sarvathi delegates clicked their mandibles together, which is their version of hysterical laughter. The Threxians actually fell off their floating platforms. Even the notoriously stoic elder of the collective, Dr. Sun, allowed one corner of his secondary mouth to twitch upward. 80 years. These people had been in space for 80 years. The Krillians had spent longer than that just arguing about what to name their first moon colony. Vreth was preparing his most diplomatic version of the phrase, adorable but no, when the chamber doors opened. Commander Dara Okonkwo of the United Earth delegation walked in, looked around the room full of laughing alien species, nodded once like she had expected exactly this, and took a bite of her sandwich. She found her seat, set down her water bottle, pulled out a data pad, and looked up at Vreth. With the calm, patient expression of someone who had all the time in the world and was perfectly comfortable using it, the laughter faded a little faster than it probably should have. Vreth, still recovering his dignity, decided the most efficient way to handle this situation was to simply present the intelligence report. Let the data speak for itself. Let the humans sit there and watch the council review exactly how unimpressive they were on paper, and perhaps they would politely withdraw their application and everyone could go back to pretending this had never happened. He pulled up the file, the holographic display bloomed to life above the center of the chamber, and the council leaned in to review the official Galactic Convergence Intelligence Assessment of Species 7442, common name, human, home world, Earth, Sol System, Milky Way outer rim, lifespan, 70 to 90 standard years. The Threxians, who routinely lived to 400, exchanged glances. Natural armor, none. The Sarvathi, whose exoskeletons could deflect a mid-range plasma bolt, made a sound that needed no translation. Venom glands, absent. Telepathic capability, 0. Cellular regeneration beyond basic wound closure, non-existent. Echolocation, no. Bioluminescence, no. Hive mind integration, absolutely not. Gravity tolerance, average. Not impressive, not terrible. Just average, like someone had designed a species by selecting the middle option on every drop-down menu. Vreth clasped two of his hands together with satisfaction. He was about to begin his prepared remarks on why the Convergence had minimum capability thresholds for a very good reason when junior researcher Pivo, who had been sitting in the analyst section looking increasingly like a small creature who had spotted a large predator, raised one trembling appendage. Pivo was young. Pivo was junior in every possible sense of the word. Pivo had been assigned this report because nobody senior wanted to spend time on a species that everyone assumed would be rejected in under 10 minutes. Pivo had read the whole thing, including the footnotes that he cleared his throat, which for his species produced a sound not unlike a very small bell being dropped down a very long staircase. Several delegates turned to look at him. He pointed to the bottom of the holographic display with the expression of someone who very much wished he had chosen a different career. Honored delegates, he said quietly, there are 17 footnotes. Vreth blinked 2 of his 4 eyes. Footnotes are supplementary, researcher. Yes, said Pivo. I am aware. I would still like to formally recommend that the Council reviews footnote 7. He said it the way someone might recommend that you check whether the bridge is actually safe before driving across it at full speed. Dara Okonkwo took another bite of her sandwich and said nothing. Pivo pulled up footnote 7. It read, in the clean, neutral language of official galactic documentation, as follows. Subject species voluntarily engages in extreme endurance and physical risk activities with no identified survival purpose, no territorial gain, no reproductive advantage, and no resource acquisition. Activities appear to be pursued for personal satisfaction and, in many recorded cases, enjoyment. The chamber was quiet. Vreth read it twice. Then he read it a third time, because sometimes things make more sense when you give them another chance. This was not one of those times. Examples are listed below, said Pivo, in the tone of a researcher who had spent 3 sleepless nights processing this information and had not yet fully arrived at the other side of it. The holographic display populated with entries: marathon, 42 kilometers. Voluntarily. On foot. For no reason. Ultramarathon, anywhere from 80 to 300 kilometers depending on the specific event, which apparently had multiple formats as though one version of this was not already completely sufficient. Ironman Triathlon, a 3.8 kilometer swim, followed immediately by 180 kilometers of cycling, followed without any meaningful rest by a full marathon. In a single day. Humans paid an entry fee to do this: free solo climbing, scaling vertical rock faces hundreds of meters high with no ropes, no safety equipment, and no backup plan beyond not falling. The Sarvathi delegate read that last one and then quietly read it again. Then came base jumping. Vreth, who was nothing if not thorough, asked Pivo to explain base jumping in plain language. Pivo explained that humans would climb to the top of a fixed structure, a cliff, a building, a bridge, and then jump off it. Voluntarily. On purpose. With a small folded piece of fabric as their only concession to the concept of survival. Vreth stared at him. Pivo nodded confirmation. Vreth looked at the display. Then at Pivo. Then at Dara Okonkwo, who had finished her sandwich and was now calmly reviewing something on her data pad as though the room around her was not quietly restructuring its entire understanding of what the word dangerous meant. They do this, Vreth said slowly, recreationally. The top competitors do it competitively, said Pivo, pulling up a related sub-entry. There are rankings. Vreth sat down that he had not planned to sit down. His legs simply made the decision without consulting him, and honestly, given the circumstances, he could not argue with them. The Threxians had stopped giggling entirely. The floating platforms drifted a few inches further from the human delegate's side of the chamber, which everyone pretended not to notice. Dara Okonkwo looked up from her data pad, glanced around the newly silent room, and smiled pleasantly, the way a person smiles when they are perfectly comfortable and see absolutely no reason to be otherwise. The silence got a little louder. It was the Threxian delegate, Counselor Mex, who made the mistake of pulling up the human military records. She had done it looking for something reassuring. Surely a species this fragile, this unarmored, this enthusiastically self-destructive in their leisure time, would at least have sensible limitations in a combat context. Surely the military data would show something that made sense. She read the first entry and set her data pad down very carefully on her floating platform, in the precise manner of someone who needed a moment before continuing. Human soldiers in documented conflict scenarios had been recorded operating at full combat effectiveness after 36 hours without sleep. Decision-making intact. Reaction times acceptable. Still moving, still communicating, still executing complex tactical plans on zero rest, and apparently whatever substance they brewed from roasted seeds that they consumed in extraordinary quantities throughout the process. 36 hours was the entry point. The records went higher. 72 hours appeared multiple times. Not as an anomaly. Not as a footnote flagged for medical concern. As a thing that had happened, been documented, and then happened again in a separate incident involving entirely different humans who had apparently also decided that sleep was more of a suggestion than a requirement. Mex leaned toward the Sarvathi delegate, Counselor Dren, and whispered that her species entered involuntary hibernation after 18 hours of sustained consciousness. It was biological. It was non-negotiable. After 18 hours, the body simply powered down whether you wanted it to or not. Dren whispered back that his species had a similar threshold and that he was, at this precise moment in this meeting, genuinely grateful for it because it meant his ancestors had never had to compete with anything like this. Vreth, still not fully recovered from base jumping, looked across the chamber at Okonkwo and asked, with the careful diplomacy of someone who was no longer entirely sure they wanted the answer, whether the commander had any personal familiarity with extended operational periods. Okonkwo looked up. She appeared to give the question genuine thought, which was somehow worse than if she had answered immediately. 60 hours, she said pleasantly. Communications blackout during a supply crisis on Titan Station. We had 17 personnel, 1 functional heating unit, and a scheduling problem that needed resolving before it became a survival problem. She paused. We resolved it. Then she reached into her bag, produced another sandwich, unwrapped it with the calm efficiency of someone who had never once in her life felt the need to justify herself to a room, and took a bite. Counselor Dren made a very small sound. Pivo wrote something in his notes. His handwriting had gotten noticeably less steady over the course of the last 30 minutes, but he was a professional, and he was going to document every single moment of this even if it took years off his life expectancy, which, he was now deeply aware, was significantly longer than Commander Okonkwo's. And she still seemed far less concerned about it than he was. It was Counselor Mex who found the sports combat files, and it was also Counselor Mex who would later request a full week of mandatory wellness leave following this meeting, a request that the Threxian High Office approved without asking a single question because they had been sent the meeting transcript. She opened the file labeled Human Recreational Combat and read the title aloud to the chamber with the hollow voice of someone who had already processed the words individually and was now attempting to process them as a complete thought. Recreational combat, not ritual combat to establish hierarchy, which the Convergence had documented in 47 other species and understood perfectly well. Not territorial combat, not survival combat, not combat born of resource scarcity or political desperation. Recreational combat. Combat that humans engaged in because the day had been long and they wanted something to do. Boxing. 2 humans entered a defined area, hit each other repeatedly in the head and body with padded fists, and continued until one of them could not continue. There were rounds. There were rules. There were judges who scored the hitting on a point system, because humans had apparently looked at the concept of punching someone and thought, we can make this more structured. Mixed martial arts expanded the available methods considerably. Punching remained on the table but was now joined by kicking, grappling, joint manipulation, and something the file described as ground and pound, which Pivo read 3 times and still felt was not a phrase that should exist in a civilized galaxy. Rugby, the file explained, involved 2 teams of large humans attempting to carry an oddly shaped ball across a field while the opposing team attempted to physically prevent this by any means the rulebook permitted, and the rulebook permitted quite a lot. There were no timeouts for injury assessment unless the injury was severe enough to require immediate removal from the field, and the threshold for what counted as severe enough was, by any galactic standard, absolutely extraordinary. Roller derby added wheels to the process, which somehow made it worse. Vreth asked the question that the entire chamber was thinking, because someone had to, and he was technically still running this meeting even if it no longer felt like anything he was in control of. They fight each other, he said. Without being at war. For fun, Pivo confirmed. Voluntarily. Enthusiastically, said Pivo, pulling up attendance records. This one, he highlighted a rugby league final, had 82,000 spectators. The chamber absorbed this. Spectators, repeated Counselor Dren. They watch, said Pivo. They purchase tickets to watch. The tickets for premium seating cost more than my monthly research stipend. There is merchandise. There are songs. Mech stood up, then sat down, then stood up again, which for a Threxian indicated a level of cognitive distress that their species typically only experienced during natural disasters. Pivo, who had by this point accepted that his evening plans were cancelled and his sleep schedule was unlikely to recover this week, pulled up a brief highlight compilation from an international rugby match, because he was thorough and because the council needed to understand the full scope of what they were looking at before they voted on anything. That he played 45 seconds of it. Counselor Mex filed a formal distress report mid-clip. Counselor Dren filed his immediately after, citing psychological welfare provisions under Convergence Charter Article 12. A third delegate, who had been so quiet throughout the meeting that several members had forgotten he was there, filed his distress report before the clip had even finished, and then asked in a very small voice whether the humans were aware that their own bodies were not designed to absorb that kind of impact repeatedly. Over a lifetime, Okonkwo, who had been watching the rugby highlights with the nostalgic warmth of someone watching a home video, looked over at him and smiled. "We are," she said cheerfully. "We have a whole medical specialty dedicated to it. Very exciting field. Lots of job security." The delegate who had asked did not file a second distress report only because the first one had not yet been processed. It was at this point in the meeting that Dr. Sun spoke. Dr. Sun of the collective did not speak often during council sessions. He was 412 years old, he had personally documented over 3,000 species across 6 galactic quadrants, and he had learned across those 4 centuries that most meetings resolved themselves adequately without his input. He was the kind of being whose silence was itself a form of communication, and most experienced delegates had learned to pay close attention to the moments when that silence ended. It ended now that he did not raise his voice. He did not gesture dramatically toward the holographic display. He simply set down the thin document he had been reading, folded his primary hands together on the table in front of him, and spoke in the quiet, measured tone of a scientist delivering findings that he had spent considerable time hoping were wrong before accepting that they were not. "I would like to add a historical note," he said, "regarding human predatory behavior. Ancestral period. Pre-civilization. Before tools were sophisticated and before projectile weapons were refined. The chamber, which had been buzzing with low urgent conversation since the rugby highlights, went still. Dr. Sun continued. "Humans," he said, "hunted by following prey on foot until the prey died." A pause. "Not by outrunning it. Humans are not the fastest land species on their planet, not even close. Their prey was faster. This was not relevant because speed was not the method." Another pause, shorter this time, as though even Dr. Sun felt the information needed a moment of separation from what came next. The method was continuation. A human hunting party would locate an animal, begin pursuing it, and simply not stop. The animal would run, rest, run again, and find the humans still coming. Still moving. Still the same steady pace. Not angry, not frenzied. Patient. The pursuit would last hours. Sometimes an entire day. The prey animal would eventually succumb to heat exhaustion and circulatory failure because it was physiologically incapable of sustaining flight for that duration, and the humans were not. He let that sit in the air of the chamber for a moment the way you might set down something fragile. They did not need to be faster, he said. They only needed to be unwilling to stop. And that, he added, almost gently, appears to have remained a consistent trait across the species' entire developmental history and into the present day. He picked up his document again and returned to reading it. The chamber did not immediately respond because the chamber was processing what it meant that a species whose ancestors had caused prey animals to die of exhaustion through sheer refusal to quit was now sitting at this table asking to be their neighbors. Vreth, who had entered this meeting with the confident energy of a diplomat who already knew how it was going to end, was no longer smiling. Not in a hostile way. Not in a frightened way exactly. In the way of someone who had picked up an object assuming it was decorative and was only now noticing it had an edge. He looked at Okonkwo. Okonkwo was making notes on her data pad with the relaxed focus of someone who was having a perfectly normal Thursday. She did not look up. She did not need to. She had grown up on a planet that had decided at some point deep in its past that the correct response to not being the biggest or the fastest or the strongest was to simply never, under any circumstances, be the one that stopped first. 412 years of xenobiology, and Dr. Sun was quite certain he had never documented anything that unsettled him in quite this specific way. He made a note of that in his personal file and returned to reading. The room was several degrees colder than it had been 20 minutes ago, and not one delegate reached for the temperature controls because somehow, in this moment, the cold felt appropriate. Okonkwo finished her sandwich. She did it without ceremony, folding the wrapper neatly, tucking it into her bag with the practiced efficiency of someone who respected both cleanliness and the concept of not making other people deal with your mess. Then she brushed the remaining crumbs from the front of her uniform with 2 precise sweeps of her hand, picked up her data pad, set it back down, and stood up. The chamber watched her the way you watch something when you are not entirely sure what it is about to do, but you have recently been given a significant amount of new information that has adjusted your baseline assumptions about what it is capable of. She smiled. It was a genuinely warm smile, the kind that reached her eyes and stayed there, and somehow that made several delegates more nervous rather than less, because they were now operating with the knowledge that warmth and lethality were not mutually exclusive traits in this particular species. "Honored delegates," she said, and her voice was easy and conversational, pitched like someone talking to colleagues rather than addressing a 600-year-old governing body that had just spent the better part of an hour being quietly horrified by her species. "Thank you for having me. I know the application came as a surprise. We did send it 3 times before this meeting and never heard back, so eventually we decided to just show up, which I understand is very on-brand for us." A beat of silence, then Counselor Mex, against what appeared to be her better judgment, made a sound that was recognizably a laugh. 2 other delegates followed, the nervous, slightly too loud laugh of people who were not entirely sure what they were laughing at but felt strongly that participating was the correct social choice. Okonkwo nodded appreciatively, like a performer acknowledging an audience, and continued, "She talked about humans. Not defensively, not as a rebuttal to everything the council had spent the last hour uncovering, but with the straightforward affection of someone describing people they genuinely liked. She talked about cooperation, how humans had started as isolated groups on a single continent and had spent millennia building towards something larger, messier, and more durable than anyone had originally planned. She talked about curiosity, how the same species that had sent people to the bottom of the ocean had also sent them to the edge of the solar system, not because either place was comfortable or safe, but because the question of what was there had been unbearable to leave unanswered. She talked about adaptability. How humans had survived ice ages, pandemics, their own catastrophic decision-making, and several near-extinction events that they did not talk about at formal functions but that had, in the long run, produced a species with an extremely flexible definition of what constituted an acceptable situation. She was funny. Not aggressively funny, not performing, just naturally, conversationally funny in the way of someone who had decided a long time ago that humor was a reasonable tool for navigating a universe that did not always make sense. She made a passing joke about the sandwich, acknowledging that she was aware it had been noted by the room, explaining that she had skipped breakfast due to travel logistics and that humans became significantly less diplomatic on an empty stomach, which the council might want to factor into future scheduling. Counselor Dren laughed at that one with slightly less nervousness than before. Pivo wrote it down verbatim in his notes and underlined it twice, then Okonkwo paused. Not a dramatic pause, not a constructed one. The pause of someone moving from one thing to another and wanting to make sure the transition was clear. "We are genuinely excited," she said, and her voice stayed warm but took on a quality underneath the warmth, something steady and very old and very certain, the voice of a species that had crossed 80 years of space on willpower and roasted seed beverages and the absolute refusal to consider stopping, about having neighbors. About being part of something larger. About cooperation on a scale we have not been able to attempt before. She looked around the chamber. Unhurried. Making contact with the room the way someone does when they want to be sure they are understood. "We really do hope," she said pleasantly, "that it stays friendly." The silence that followed that sentence was not an empty silence. It was a full silence, packed densely with 600 years of galactic diplomacy collectively arriving at the same conclusion at the same moment. Nobody moved. Vreth, who had 4 throats and was therefore theoretically capable of filling any silence with minimal effort, said nothing. Dr. Sun, who had 412 years of experience and had documented 3,000 species and had seen things that would recalibrate most beings' understanding of the universe, looked at his folded hands and was quiet. Pivo, who had read the footnotes, who had known since footnote 7 that this meeting was not going to go the way anyone expected, sat very still and felt the particular feeling of someone who has watched an event coming from a long way off and has now watched it arrive exactly on schedule. Okonkwo sat back down, uncapped her water bottle, and took a drink. The silence continued for another 4 seconds, which in a chamber of experienced galactic diplomats was approximately 3.5 seconds longer than silences usually lasted. then everyone began talking at once, and the meeting entered a new phase, and nothing about it was the same as it had been before she stood up. Galactic Convergence membership votes had a formal procedure. There was a reason for this. 600 years of interstellar diplomacy had produced a process that was thorough, deliberate, and designed to ensure that no species was admitted to the convergence without full and careful consideration of all relevant factors by all sitting delegates. The process involved 3 rounds of structured deliberation, a formal statement of position from each delegation, a recess period of no less than 2 standard hours for independent consultation, and then a weighted vote calculated against each member species' tenure in the convergence and their accumulated diplomatic standing. It was a good process. It was a fair process. It was a process that had served the convergence with dignity and consistency across 6 centuries of operation. It took 11 seconds. Vreth called the vote before the procedural motion had fully cleared his secondary throat, which several delegates later noted was technically out of order but which nobody felt strongly enough about to challenge given the circumstances. His hand went up so fast and with such conviction that his elbow caught the edge of his water vessel, sending it skidding across the council table, its contents spreading in a slow, dignified arc across his prepared remarks on minimum capability thresholds, which he had spent considerable time writing that morning and which now no longer felt relevant in any meaningful sense. He did not stop to address the water. He kept his hand up and his eyes forward with the focused energy of a being who had made a decision and was fully committed to it. Every other hand went up within the following 10 seconds. Not reluctantly. Not after careful deliberation. With the synchronized certainty of a chamber full of experienced diplomats who had all, independently and simultaneously, done the mental calculation and arrived at the same answer, which was that humanity was going to do what humanity was going to do regardless of how this vote went, and being on the correct side of that reality was an extremely straightforward choice. Councillor Mex voted yes while still technically filing her distress report, which required a brief administrative note in the meeting record but was ultimately processed without issue. Pivo, who was not a voting delegate and therefore could not participate officially, made a small checkmark in his personal notes with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose footnotes had, against considerable odds, changed the course of galactic history. Humanity was admitted to the Galactic Convergence with full membership rights, full diplomatic protections, full access to shared research archives, trade route privileges, and every other benefit that 6 centuries of collective interstellar civilization had to offer. There was also a memo. It was not an official memo. It did not appear in any formal record or published documentation. It circulated through private diplomatic channels over the following week, passed from senior delegate to senior delegate with the quiet urgency of information that everyone needed and nobody wanted to be seen distributing. It was 4 sentences long. It noted that humanity had been admitted. It noted that humanity appeared to be, by any available metric, extremely motivated, highly adaptable, and entirely comfortable with physical and psychological conditions that would constitute an emergency for most convergent species. It noted that humanity had specifically and on the record expressed hope that galactic relations would remain friendly, in a tone that all recipients were encouraged to sit with for a moment before continuing. The final sentence recommended, in the careful language of people who understood how to say things without technically saying them, that no convergence member species take any action that might cause humanity to form a contrary opinion. The memo had no formal author. It did not need one. Every delegate who received it read it, deleted it from their official systems, and remembered every word. News traveled fast in the convergence. This was one of the less discussed benefits of 6 centuries of interstellar cooperation, the fact that information moved across 14 star systems with the speed and enthusiasm of something that did not require anyone's permission and was not going to wait for an official press release. The story of humanity's membership vote reached the outer systems within 72 hours. Which was fast even by convergent standards, and suggested strongly that more than one delegate had contacted someone the moment the session adjourned and possibly before they had fully left the building. The reaction varied by species, location, and how much context the recipient had when they first heard it, but the general shape of it was consistent across all 14 systems. A brief period of dismissal, followed by a longer period of looking things up, followed by a very quiet period in which a great many beings sat alone with their thoughts and reassessed several assumptions they had been Carrying around comfortably for years, the Kreth Dominion's reaction was perhaps the most concrete. The Kreth Dominion was a moderately sized empire situated at the edge of what they had been internally referring to, for approximately the last decade, as the Expansion Zone, which was a name they used in private documents and had the good political sense not to use publicly because the Expansion Zone was, in straightforward geographic terms, mostly human space. They had been planning what their strategic documents called a territorial consolidation, which was the kind of phrase that meant exactly what it sounded like while maintaining the grammatical appearance of something more reasonable. The plan had been in development for 8 years. It had a timeline, a resource allocation, a fleet assignment, and a very confident internal memo about how the humans, newly spacefaring and diplomatically inexperienced, were unlikely to mount an effective response. The Kreth Dominion received the transcript of the council meeting on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the territorial consolidation plan had been quietly moved from the active strategic file to a folder that their chief military architect labeled Miscellaneous Historical Documents, which was the Kreth equivalent of putting something in a drawer you intend never to open again. No announcement was made. No explanation was offered. The fleet that had been provisionally assigned to the operation was reassigned to routine patrol duties with paperwork that did not reference the previous assignment at all. 3 senior strategists who had been the plan's most vocal advocates requested transfers to departments that had no involvement with human space, and all 3 requests were approved with unusual speed. Elsewhere, the reaction was more academic but no less intense. 3 separate species launched formal research programs within a month of the vote, all focused on the same broad subject area and all titled with the careful neutrality of scientists who were personally unsettled but professionally obligated to investigate. The programs covered human nutritional habits, which turned out to be extraordinarily varied and in several cases baffling. Human sleep patterns, which confirmed that the military records were not anomalies but simply the outer edge of a general species-wide tendency to treat rest as negotiable. And human emotional expression, specifically the question of why humans smiled as much as they did, what it indicated, and whether it correlated with any measurable internal state in a way that could be reliably interpreted by an outside observer. That last research program was the largest, the best funded, and the one that produced the most inconclusive results, because the answer turned out to be complicated in ways that resisted clean documentation. Humans smiled when they were happy. They also smiled when they were nervous, when they were being polite, when they were angry and choosing not to show it, when they were about to do something that the researchers came to privately categorize as deeply inadvisable, and sometimes, most disturbingly, when they were in situations that by any external metric should not have produced a smile at all. The lead researcher on that program submitted her final report with a 2-paragraph addendum noting that after 18 months of study, she had concluded that human optimism was not a psychological quirk or a cultural artifact but appeared to be a load-bearing feature of the species, something structural, something that had been selected for across deep evolutionary time because species that maintained functional hope in terrible situations survived them more often than species that did not. She noted that this was, from a purely clinical standpoint, remarkable. She did not note, because it was outside the scope of her research, that it also kept her awake at night. It was a Threxian philosopher named Ques Aravel who articulated what most of the galaxy was feeling but had not yet found the language for. She published an essay 14 months after the vote, in a minor academic journal that did not typically attract wide readership, titled Optimism as a Survival Mechanism, or Reconsideration of Human Psychological Architecture in Evolutionary Context. It was 42 pages long. It was dense, carefully argued, and written in the precise formal register of serious academic philosophy. It cited 317 sources. It had footnotes, which given the current cultural moment landed with a particular resonance that Ques Aravel had not entirely intended but did not discourage. It became the best-selling publication in Threxian academic history within 6 weeks of release. It was translated into 31 galactic languages within 4 months. The human translation was handled by a publishing house in a city called Toronto, whose editorial team read the manuscript, found it extremely flattering, sent a warm thank you note to the author, and then immediately began arguing cheerfully among themselves about which parts they disagreed with, because they were human and that was what humans did with ideas they liked. Ques era vel received the note, read it 4 times, and added a postscript to the second edition. The postscript was one sentence. It said that in the time since publication she had come to believe that the essay's central argument was correct but that she had significantly underestimated the scale of what she was describing, and she was comfortable going on record with that assessment. The second edition sold better than the first. Nobody had planned for Pivo to become the galaxy's foremost authority on human behavior. Least of all Pvo.it had happened the way most things in his life happened, gradually, then completely, without a clear moment he could point to and say yes, that was when I should have made a different choice. He had been assigned the Human Intelligence Report because he was junior and the report was considered unimportant. He had read the footnotes because he was thorough and thoroughness was the only professional trait he had ever been consistently praised for. He had raised his appendage in that chamber because the information seemed relevant and withholding relevant information went against every research instinct he had spent 8 years of graduate study developing, and now here he was. 4 years later. Lead researcher at the newly established Convergence Institute for Human Studies, which had a building with his name on a plaque near the entrance, 3 dozen researchers reporting to him, a budget that would have seemed implausible to his graduate self, and an invitation to speak at 14 academic conferences in the next calendar year, all of which he had accepted because declining felt professionally irresponsible and personally he had not yet developed a compelling reason to say no. That did not sound exactly like what it was, which was fear. His work was celebrated. This was not an exaggeration or a modest deflection. His first major publication, a comprehensive behavioral analysis of human stress responses, had been cited 400 times in its first year. His second paper, examining human social bonding patterns under adverse conditions, had prompted the collective to revise 3 standing assumptions in their xenosociology curriculum. His third paper, on human humor as a coping mechanism, had been described by Dr. Sun himself as the most illuminating thing he had read in 40 years, which was the kind of endorsement that changed a career permanently and which Pivo had framed and hung on his office wall and occasionally looked at when he needed to remember that the work was worthwhile. That he was celebrated. He was respected. He was frequently described in academic circles as brave, which he appreciated in principle while privately noting that bravery implied a choice, and he was no longer entirely sure the research had been something he had chosen so much as something that had chosen him on the day he read footnote 7 and could not put it down. That he was also, in a way that he had discussed with his physician and 2 separate therapists and had come to accept as simply a feature of his current life, deeply and specifically unsettled by his area of expertise, not frightened. He wanted to be precise about this because frightened implied something irrational and his unsettlement was entirely rational, grounded in documented evidence, and proportionate to the material. He simply worked, every day, with information about a species that ran toward difficulty, slept as little as possible, hit each other for entertainment, smiled in situations that did not warrant smiling, and had once, in the ancestral past, caused animals to die by the method of continuing to exist in their vicinity. This was fine. This was his career. He was proud of it. He had recurring dreams about marathons, not nightmares exactly. Just dreams in which he was standing at the side of a very long road and humans were running past him, one after another, steady and patient and showing no intention of stopping, and he would stand there watching them go by and the road would keep extending and the humans would keep running and he would wake up feeling a feeling he had eventually identified, after considerable reflection, as a mixture of profound admiration and the specific variety of existential unease that comes from studying something you respect enormously and understand completely and would never, under any circumstances, want to erase. He had mentioned the dreams to his therapist. His therapist had asked thoughtful questions, made careful notes, and at the end of the session suggested, diplomatically, that perhaps the recurring imagery was his mind's way of processing the central tension of his work, which was that he spent his days documenting a species defined by forward motion while sitting very still at a desk. Pivo had considered this, then he had gone home, made himself a large cup of the warm beverage his species used for comfort, sat in his favorite chair, and pulled up his notes for the next paper, which was on human endurance psychology and which he expected would be both his most important work and the one most likely to produce a new recurring dream. He was right on both counts. The paper won the Convergence's highest research honor the following year. Pivo accepted the award at a ceremony attended by delegates from 30 species, gave a thoughtful and carefully prepared speech, shook many hands and touched many appendages, and smiled for photographs with the warm, slightly distracted expression of a being whose mind was already 3 chapters into the next project. That night he dreamed about an ultramarathon. And the dream it was raining. The humans didn't seem to notice. Earth was raining when Okonkwo got home, not dramatically. Not the kind of rain that arrives with thunder and intention and demands to be noticed. Just the quiet, steady, entirely unremarkable rain that falls on a Tuesday evening in Lagos when the city has things to do and the weather has decided to participate anyway. It came down against her apartment windows in a soft continuous murmur while she changed out of her uniform, made herself a cup of tea she did not finish, and sat down at her desk with the comfortable exhale of someone returning to a place that fit them correctly. She pulled up the video call. Her mother answered on the second ring, which meant she had been nearby and expecting it, which meant someone had told her about the council session, which meant Okonkwo's colleague Bade had absolutely sent a message ahead because Bade had no concept of letting a person deliver their own news and never had. Her mother looked exactly as she always looked. Settled. Sharp. Wearing the expression she had perfected across several decades of raising a daughter who brought home interesting situations and described them as fine. So, her mother said, dispensing with preamble the way she dispensed with most things that were not load-bearing, how did it go? It was not quite a question. It never really was with her mother. It was more of an opening, a door held wide, an invitation to walk through and say the thing. Okonkwo grinned. The same grin she had been sitting on since the vote. The one she had maintained as a calm, professional smile throughout the meeting and the debrief and the transit home, and which was now, in the privacy of her own apartment with nobody watching except someone who had seen every version of it since she was 4 years old, allowed to be what it actually was. They were very welcoming, she said. Her mother looked at her for a long moment with the evaluating precision of a woman who had spent a lifetime reading this particular face. Did you behave? She said. Okonkwo considered the question with the appearance of genuine reflection. Mostly, she said. Her mother made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh and was somehow both, the sound of someone who had long ago made peace with the specific variety of chaos their life contained and had chosen to find it funny because the alternative was exhausting. They talked for 20 minutes. About the council chamber, which Okonkwo described as impressive but drafty. About the delegates, who she described as lovely once they relaxed, which took a while but happened eventually. About the vote, which she described as unanimous and fast, and at which point her mother said good because anything else would have been insulting, and Okonkwo said yes. They seemed to reach the same conclusion. She did not mention the footnotes. She did not mention Pivo's expression when he pulled up the rugby highlights, or the sound Councillor Dren had made after the 60-hour shift story, or the way the room had gone very still after Dr. Sun finished speaking, or the 4 seconds of silence after her last line that had been, if she was being honest with herself in the privacy of her own head, the most satisfying 4 seconds of her professional career. Some things were better held quietly. Savored privately. There would be reports to write and she would write them accurately and completely, but some textures of a moment were for the person who had been in the room, and she intended to keep this one. Her mother told her to eat something real before she went to sleep. Okonkwo said she would. Her mother looked at her with the expression that meant she knew exactly how seriously that commitment was being made. They said goodnight with the ease of people who had been saying goodnight to each other across various distances for years and expected to keep doing it for many more. The call ended, the rain continued against the windows, quiet and steady and entirely unbothered. Okonkwo sat for a moment in the particular stillness of a room after a conversation, the kind of stillness that has texture to it, that holds the shape of the words that were just in it. Then she reached into her bag and took out an energy drink, the tall silver kind with the aggressive font on the label that her physician described as technically legal and her mother described as concerning and that she described as necessary, and cracked it open with the clean decisive snap of someone beginning the next part of the day. She pulled up her files. The next session was in 3 weeks. There were 14 items on the preliminary agenda, 4 of which were going to require significant preparation, 2 of which were going to require significant diplomacy, and 1 of which was going to require both, plus the particular quality of patience that her species had developed across deep evolutionary time by chasing things across long distances until the situation resolved itself in their favor. She was looking forward to it, outside, across 14 star systems, in council chambers and research institutes and strategic planning offices and the private quarters of beings who were lying awake thinking about things they had recently learned. The galaxy was still processing what had happened. Still recalibrating. Still sitting with the slowly arriving understanding that the small, short-lived, unarmored, enthusiastically self-endangering species from the outer rim of an unremarkable solar system had just been handed a seat at the table they had spent 600 years building, still arriving, collectively and individually, at the conclusion that Pivo had reached alone in an archive room on the day he read footnote 7. That the report had looked like a list of weaknesses, that it was not. The galaxy had been very welcoming, that IT had no idea what it had just let in.